even though the Articles of Confederation were a hot mess, one benefit it did create was it forced leaders of our country to re-examine what it was that they wanted to see in a government. And so it was a good catalyst to start the motion of change. And one of the last sparks that opened people's eyes to the need of change was Shays' Rebellion. Shays' Rebellion was a series of armed rebellions in which rebels attacked courthouses to protest the foreclosure of farms, and this was in addition to other fiscal issues. But essentially, these attacks really prompted the most prominent leaders to decide to get together in Philadelphia beginning in 1787 to start working on a new constitution. And there were 55 delegates who attended the Constitution. There were delegates from 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island, out of protesting of some financial issues, decided not to send a delegate. And notably, Virginia's Patrick Henry, who famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death," he feared that this Constitution would create too strong of a central government, and so he also abstained from attending out of protest. Just some other facts about the delegates who attended the convention. These men can all be described as well-read, well-bred, well-fed, and well-wed. And what this refers to is that they were some of the most highly educated, intellectual, wealthiest men living in the country at that time. In addition, many of them were married to some of the most prominent families living in the states. They included James Madison, who earned the nickname the Father of our Constitution, George Washington, who would become the presiding officer at the convention, Benjamin Franklin, who was considered an elder statesman, and Alexander Hamilton, who was a huge proponent of a strong central government. Now, with 55 men, this is going to bring with it all sorts of different ideas, priorities, wants, needs that they wanted to see be put into action in the Constitution. There were areas of agreement, and there were also some issues that had to be resolved with compromise. When we talk about areas of agreement, the first was that the Articles of Confederation definitely needed to go. I did not mention this in part 1 of chapter 2, but my favorite quote from the Articles of Confederation is that its objective was to create a league of friendship among the states. And I think if we were to examine what a clear goal of a government should be, I'm not sure if many of us today would say that creating a loose league of friendship is really what we would seek. And so the Articles unanimously had to go. There also was a huge agreement in the fact that these delegates wanted to see a republican form of government. They also wanted to see a constitutional government in which there was limited power by the national government. And in order to do this, they wanted to see a balance of power that essentially was taking this idea of separating powers so that not one part would be too powerful. The delegates also wanted property owners to have the right to vote, and property owners alone. It's very interesting that within the first sentence of the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote that all men are created equal. And I know you guys can't see me right now, but I have a smirk on my face because that word men should really have an asterisk next to it. Because as we know, looking at our social history in the United States, it's really not until 1964 where all people, regardless of sex, race, are guaranteed and actually can practice these rights that the delegates at the Constitutional Convention fought so much for. And lastly, the delegates wanted to see the government protect property rights. Now, obviously, owning property was not a privilege for all people living in the United States at this time, so a lot of these priorities specifically pertain to the people at this convention. Now, although they agreed on many issues, there were some topics that needed to be, again, resolved by reaching a compromise. These included issues like representation, slavery, and electing a president. And we're going to go a little bit more into depth about each of these in a moment. And then lastly, ratification politics. And this is, how do we finalize and pass the Constitution? And we will see that this question splits the group of delegates into two clear factions: the Federalists, who were in favor of a strong federal or national government, and the Anti-Federalists, who were too powerful of a federal government and would not ratify the Constitution without the addition of a Bill of Rights. So first, let's look at the topic of representation. There were two plans put on the table at the convention. The first was the Virginia plan, in which the delegates who favored this believed that representation should be proportional to state population. Obviously, this concept is going to favor states that had a larger population because they then would have more representation. On the other side of this argument, the New Jersey plan was presented that said that equal representation for each state should exist regardless of size. And of course, common sense should tell you that smaller states were going to favor this plan because they did not want to be overpowered by states that had more people. And in the end, the compromise reached was known as the Connecticut Compromise or the Great Compromise. And this is the compromise that essentially created for us a bicameral legislature, giving us the House of Representatives, where representation is based on the number of people living in a state, and the number of senators per state, which is the fixed number of 2. So no matter how big or small a state is, each state will have 2 representatives in that chamber of Congress. At the end of the day, the Great Compromise is what allowed the delegates to move forward with the Constitution. However, a lot of people believe that this ended up giving more power for the smaller states because the House and the Senate have to do so much working together in theory, not practice right now, but because each state, regardless of size, got 2 senators, and because the Senate really has more powers per the Constitution, some people still believe that the small states actually got out ahead in this argument. The 3/5 compromise was how the delegates resolved the topic of slavery. In the North, the northern states wanted slaves to count for taxation but not representation. In the South, southern delegates did not want slaves to count as anything. So the compromise is that each slave would count as 3/5 of a person in terms of calculating population and therefore representation in the House of Representatives. So at the end of the day, slavery, in terms of how each slave would be counted for representation, was solved with this compromise. Obviously, you guys remember from your U.S. history classes that kind of just hammering out this fractional compromise did not solve moral or all political issues of slavery, but it was, again, what let the delegates move on to the next step in the Constitution. When we look at electing a president, and I didn't create a slide for it, just some of the questions that they needed to answer included things like, how long should a president serve? 1 year? Should it be indefinitely? And the compromised reach was that a president should be elected to serve in 4-year terms. And again, these issues were each resolved and allowed the delegates to move on with the Constitution.